Have you ever felt like you were carrying something so heavy that it took your breath away, yet when people looked at you, they saw nothing? Have you ever smiled through conversations while feeling like there was a weight pressing down on your chest, invisible to everyone around you? If you have, then this story is for you. If you've ever wondered why some pain feels heavier than the world itself, yet no one else seems to notice, then you need to hear about Sarah. Sarah lived in a small town in Oregon, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and your business, but not necessarily your heart. At 37, she had what most people would consider a good life. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, had a comfortable house with a garden she tended on weekends, and was known in her community as someone you could count on. People saw her as strong, reliable, always there when others needed help. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, were the stones. Every morning, Sarah would wake up and feel them there, these invisible stones that seemed to have taken residence in her chest. The first one had appeared the day her mother died, 5 years earlier. She had been holding her mother's hand when she passed, and instead of feeling peace or closure, Sarah felt this heavy, smooth stone settle right below her heart. It was the stone of unspoken words, of all the conversations they'd never had, all the forgiveness that had remained unasked for and ungiven. The second stone came 2 years later when her marriage ended, not with shouting or drama, but with the quiet realization that she and David had become strangers sharing the same space. When he moved out, taking half their belongings but somehow leaving the house feeling completely empty, another stone settled in. This one was jagged, cutting her every time she breathed too deeply. It was the stone of failed dreams, of the children they'd planned to have, of the life they'd sketched out together on Sunday mornings over coffee. The third stone was the smallest but perhaps the heaviest. It came the night she realized she hadn't laughed genuinely in months. She was watching a comedy on television, the kind of show that used to make her laugh until her stomach hurt, and she found herself wondering when joy had become something she had to remember how to do. This tiny stone settled right next to the others, and it whispered to her every day, "You're not who you used to be, and you may never find your way back." Sarah carried these stones everywhere. To work, where she cared for others with a tenderness born from her own pain. To the grocery store, where she'd find herself staring at the cereal aisle, overwhelmed by choices that seemed impossibly trivial. To bed each night, where they made it hard to find a comfortable position, hard to rest, hard to dream of anything but the weight she carried. The thing about invisible stones is that they're perfect mimics. They learn to hide in plain sight. When people asked Sarah how she was doing, she'd say fine with such practiced ease that even she almost believed it. When her sister called from California, worried about her living alone, Sarah would fill the conversation with updates about work, the weather, the neighbor's new dog, anything to avoid the silence where the stones might be heard shifting in her chest. She became an expert at making her pain invisible, not just to others, but to herself. She'd wake up, shower, dress, and go through her day with the kind of efficiency that made people admire her strength. But late at night, when the house was quiet and there was no one to perform for, Sarah would lie in bed and feel the full weight of everything she carried. Sometimes she'd place her hand on her chest, right where the stones had settled, and wonder if this was just who she was now. The woman with the invisible load. Months passed this way, then a year. Sarah learned to navigate life with her stones the way people learn to walk with a chronic injury, adjusting their gait, finding workarounds, making accommodations. She discovered that staying busy helped. If she filled every moment with tasks and responsibilities, there was less time to notice the weight. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, took on extra shifts at the hospital, started a small garden that required daily attention. Motion became medicine, but motion, as Sarah would discover, is not the same as healing. It's a temporary relief, like taking aspirin for a broken bone. The pain might lessen, but the break remains, waiting for proper care. And invisible stones, it turns out, have a way of making themselves known, no matter how skillfully we learn to carry them. The day everything changed started like any other. Sarah woke at 6, made coffee, checked the weather on her phone, and prepared for another shift at the hospital. But as she was putting on her scrubs, something strange happened. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror caught her eye, and for just a moment, she saw herself as if she were a stranger. What she saw made her stop completely. The woman in the mirror looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Her shoulders were curved forward slightly, as if she were protecting something precious in her chest. Her eyes, which had once been bright and quick to smile, now held a kind of careful distance. This wasn't the natural aging that comes with time. This was the reshaping that comes from carrying too much for too long. Sarah stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, really looking at herself. When had her posture changed? When had her face settled into this expression of quiet endurance? When had she become someone who looked like she was braced against the world instead of walking through it? At work that day, she found herself noticing other people differently. Her colleague Janet, who always seemed so put together, had dark circles under her eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. Mrs. Rodriguez, who came in for her regular blood pressure check, sat a little too straight in her chair, as if she too were holding something heavy. Martinez, usually jovial and quick with jokes, seemed to be forcing his smile lately. It was as if seeing her own invisible weight clearly for the first time had given Sarah a new kind of vision. She began to recognize the signs of invisible carrying in others, the way people held their breath a little too long when they thought no one was watching, the way conversations stayed safely on the surface, never diving into the deeper waters where stones might be disturbed. That evening, Sarah did something she hadn't done in years. Instead of rushing home to fill the hours with activity, she drove to the small park at the edge of town. It was a simple place, just a few benches, some old oak trees, and a pond where ducks gathered in the early morning and late afternoon. She sat on a bench facing the water, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did absolutely nothing. At first, the stillness felt uncomfortable. Her mind immediately began creating a list of things she should be doing at home, errands she needed to run, people she should call. But she stayed put, watching the light change on the water as the sun began to set. And slowly, in that quiet space, she began to feel the stones more clearly. The first stone, her mother's stone, felt smooth and cold. As she sat there, Sarah found herself thinking not about the conversations they'd never had, but about the ones they did have. Her mother teaching her to knit on winter afternoons, the way she'd hum while cooking dinner, the time she'd stayed up all night when Sarah had pneumonia as a child, checking her temperature and bringing her sips of water. These memories didn't make the stone disappear, but somehow they made it feel less sharp. The second stone, the marriage stone, was harder to face. It carried not just the loss of David, but the loss of the future they'd planned, the children they'd never have, the growing old together that would never happen. But as Sarah sat in the growing dusk, she found herself remembering that there had been good reasons for the marriage to end. They had grown into different people with different dreams. The divorce, painful as it was, had freed them both to find better fits for who they were becoming. The third stone, the joy stone, was the strangest to examine. Sarah realized that she'd been waiting for joy to return to her the way it used to be, bright and effortless and spontaneous. But maybe joy didn't have to be loud to be real. Maybe it could be quiet and deliberate and earned. Maybe it could be found in the satisfaction of helping a patient feel better, in the way her garden tomatoes tasted like summer, in the simple fact that she'd survived everything she'd been through and was still here, still trying, still capable of feeling. As the first stars appeared, Sarah made a decision that surprised her. She wasn't going to try to get rid of the stones. She was going to learn to carry them differently. They were part of her story now, part of what had shaped her into someone who could sit with pain without being destroyed by it, someone who could help others carry their invisible loads because she knew what carrying felt like. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to experiment with this new relationship to her stones. Instead of trying to outrun them with busyness, she started to acknowledge them. In the morning, instead of jumping straight into her routine, she'd take a moment to check in with herself. How are the stones today? Are they sharp or smooth? Heavy or manageable? This wasn't about wallowing or being dramatic. It was about being honest with herself about what she was actually experiencing. She discovered that the stones had different personalities on different days. Sometimes they were quiet, barely noticeable, unless she really focused on them. Other days, they seemed to vibrate with old pain, demanding attention. On those difficult days, instead of pretending everything was fine, Sarah learned to be gentle with herself. She'd make tea instead of coffee, choose the softer sweater, take the longer way home through the neighborhood with the pretty gardens. Something remarkable began to happen. As Sarah stopped fighting the stones and started carrying them with intention, they began to change. The sharp edges became smoother. The weight remained, but it distributed differently, becoming less of a concentrated burden and more of a distributed strength. She found she could breathe more easily, stand straighter, even laugh again, though the laughter now had depth to it that it hadn't possessed before. At work, her colleagues began to comment that she seemed different, though they couldn't put their finger on how. She was still the same reliable, caring person she'd always been, but there was something new in her presence. She seemed more solid somehow, more genuinely there. When patients were in pain, she had a way of sitting with them that made them feel less alone. When families were scared, her calm felt authentic rather than professional. Sarah realized that her stones had become teachers. The Mother Stone taught her that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes form. The conversations she'd never had with her mother were still happening in the way Sarah cared for others, in the kindness she showed to confused elderly patients, in the way she remembered to call her sister just to say hello. Her mother's love lived on in Sarah's actions, transformed but undiminished. The marriage stone taught her about resilience and the courage it takes to start over. Every day she woke up in her house and chose to make it feel like home, rather than a reminder of what was missing was an act of bravery. Every time she introduced herself as Sarah, rather than David's ex-wife, was a small declaration of independence. The stone reminded her that she was complete on her own, not half of something broken. The joy stone taught her perhaps the most important lesson of all, that happiness doesn't have to be constant to be real. There's a difference between temporary happiness and deep contentment, between the joy that depends on everything going right and the joy that exists because you're alive and able to experience beauty, even in the midst of difficulty. Sarah's new joy was quieter, but more reliable than her old joy had been. 6 months after that evening in the park, Sarah was working a late shift when they brought in a woman about her own age who'd been in a car accident. Nothing life-threatening, but she was shaken and alone, waiting for test results. As Sarah was checking her IV, the woman started to cry, not from physical pain, but from something deeper. "I'm sorry," the woman said, wiping her eyes. "I don't know why I'm falling apart. It wasn't even a bad accident. I should be grateful." Sarah sat down beside the bed. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "our bodies know it's safe to feel things before our minds do." The accident might not have been serious, but maybe it reminded you of other things you've been carrying around. The woman looked at Sarah with surprise, as if no one had ever suggested that her feelings might make sense. They talked for the next 20 minutes, not about medical things, but about life things. The woman's recent divorce, her worry about her teenage daughter, her mother who had dementia and didn't recognize her anymore, all the invisible stones she'd been carrying alone. Before the woman was discharged, she took Sarah's hand. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the medical care, though that was wonderful. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me." Sarah squeezed her hand back and realized that this was why she'd needed to learn to carry her own stones consciously. Not so she could get rid of them, but so she could help others carry theirs. The truth Sarah discovered is that we all carry invisible stones. They come from losses and disappointments, from words said and unsaid, from dreams deferred and hearts broken. Some people carry stones from childhood that have been with them so long they've forgotten what life felt like before them. Others collect new stones regularly, accumulating weight with each difficult experience. But here's what Sarah learned that changed everything. The goal isn't to eliminate the stones. The goal is to transform your relationship with them. When we acknowledge our invisible loads instead of pretending they don't exist, something powerful happens. The stones don't disappear, but they stop controlling us. They become part of our strength rather than our weakness, part of our wisdom rather than our burden. Think about people you admire, people who seem to have a deep kind of strength. Often, these aren't people who've never suffered. They're people who've learned to carry their suffering consciously, who've allowed their wounds to become wisdom, their pain to become compassion. They've learned to walk with their stones in a way that makes them more human, not less. Sarah's life today looks similar to what it was 2 years ago. She still works as a nurse, still lives in her house with the garden, still tends to others with care and skill. But the quality of her presence has changed completely. She moves through the world with a kind of settled strength, like a tree that has grown deep roots. The storms still come, but they don't threaten to uproot her anymore. She's learned to have conversations with her stones, to check in with them the way you might check in with an old friend who's been through hard times. Some days they're quiet companions. Other days they need more attention. She's learned the difference between honoring their presence and being overwhelmed by it. Most importantly, Sarah has learned to recognize the invisible stones in others. She sees them in the way her neighbor Mrs. Chen stands a little too straight when she mentions her estranged son. She sees them in her colleague Mark's too bright smile when he talks about his recent separation. She sees them in the grocery store clerk who works extra shifts to avoid going home to an empty apartment. And when she recognizes these invisible loads in others, Sarah has learned to offer something precious: witness. Not advice, not solutions, not attempts to fix or minimize, just the simple acknowledgement that yes, you're carrying something heavy, and no, you don't have to carry it alone. Sometimes the most healing thing we can offer another person is to see their invisible stones and not turn away. If you're listening to this story and feeling the weight of your own invisible stones, know this: you're not broken. You're not weak. You're not doing life wrong. You're human, which means you feel things deeply, love things that can be lost, and hope for things that don't always come to pass. The stones you carry are evidence of your capacity to care, to risk, to remain open to life even when life has hurt you. Your stones might be different from Sarah's. Maybe you carry the stone of a childhood that wasn't what it should have been. Maybe you carry the stone of opportunities missed or chances not taken. Maybe you carry the stone of words that were said that can't be unsaid, or words that weren't said that can never be spoken now. Maybe you carry the stone of a body that doesn't work the way it used to, or a mind that feels too busy or too sad or too anxious. Whatever stones you carry, they are yours for a reason. Not because you deserve them or because you're being punished, but because your soul is strong enough to transform weight into wisdom, burden into strength, pain into compassion. You have the capacity not just to survive what you've been through, but to let it teach you how to help others survive what they're going through. The path forward isn't about discarding your stones or pretending they don't exist. It's about learning to carry them with consciousness and grace. It's about discovering that the very things that have weighted you down can become the foundation of your strength. It's about understanding that your invisible load, acknowledged and integrated, can become visible wisdom that helps light the way for others. Sarah still visits the park sometimes, especially on difficult days. She sits on the same bench and talks to her stones the way you might talk to old friends who've been through everything with you. She thanks them for what they've taught her, asks them what they need from her, listens to what they have to say. This isn't dwelling on the past or wallowing in pain. It's staying connected to all parts of herself, even the parts that carry old hurts. And sometimes, sitting there by the water, Sarah feels something remarkable, a lightness that doesn't come from having fewer stones, but from carrying them with such skill that they've become part of her natural strength. Like a dancer who's trained so long with weights that removing them makes her feel like she could fly, Sarah has learned to move with her invisible load so gracefully that it's become a source of power rather than limitation. This is the gift of conscious carrying. It transforms us, not by removing our difficulties, but by teaching us to move with them in ways that create beauty instead of just survival. When we learn to carry our stones with awareness and acceptance, we develop a kind of strength that can't be taught any other way. We become people who can hold space for others' pain because we've learned to hold space for our own. If you're feeling the weight of invisible stones today, remember Sarah's story. Remember that strength doesn't mean having no stones to carry. It means they're not evidence of your failure or weakness. They're the raw materials from which wisdom is made, the weights that are training you for a kind of strength that can only be earned through experience. They're the what would you, there are, not because someday they are part, a woman, this is to under, your deep, take them, but you have all, it's this, if this, let them, we need your stone, trust, there are, this, Sarah's, every, thank you, if this, by being the your stone, this is the woman, may you discover the strength to carry them consciously, and may you